All right, it is noon in the Eastern time zone where our campus is located. It is a pleasure to welcome you all to our session today. We'll be talking with Dr. Susan Goodwin on cybersecurity challenges in the financial sector. This should be a great session since finances impact all of us, banking impacts all of us, and I think you were in for a treat with some excellent information. It'll be coming your way this afternoon. Now, let me talk a little bit about the agenda. As I mentioned, my name is Bill Gibbs. I'm on the graduate admissions team and also the Cap Tech Talks host. If you try to say that 3 times in a hurry, you will discover why I struggled with that. Anyway, let's get back to the agenda. We're first going to talk just briefly about capital technology. We always have a handful of people who are not that familiar with our university. Then we'll talk about our housekeeping, our session pointers. I'll introduce a presenter. Then we'll hear the presentation by Dr. Goodwin, which will take the bulk of our time together, of course. We'll leave a generous amount of time for Q&A, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Toward the very end, after Dr. Goodwin is done with her presentation, we'll talk about our upcoming webinars. I'm really excited about what's coming down the pike later this spring and how to get a copy of their recording, slides, and certificate. And speaking of recording, the session is being recorded and will be made available both to all of those who registered, to you all, and as well as placed on our YouTube channel. Many of you are extremely familiar with capital. I see students, I see faculty members, and others. But I did want to make sure that those who may not be as familiar with us know a little bit about us. We were established in 1927, which means we're in our 95th year of operation. We'll celebrate our 100th anniversary coming up this decade. We're one of the only private universities in the state of Maryland and indeed anywhere in the United States that is so specifically devoted to STEM, engineering, cybersecurity, computer sciences, and the management of technology. We're a nonprofit, private, and accredited, and a lot of times we have visitors who are joining us from overseas and may not understand accreditation in the United States. It's a very important thing to certify that your university is worthy of pursuing a degree, and we are accredited by the Middle States Commission on Higher Education. This is regional accreditation, which is the highest level of accreditation available to any university in the United States, the regional accreditation. Also, the state of Maryland, where we're located in Laurel, Maryland, authorize us to confer degrees all the way from our 2-year associate degrees right up to our 3 doctoral degrees, the DBA, the Doctor of Science, and the PhD degrees. So you're in good hands today, and actually, when I introduce our speaker, you'll see that she is a product of capital and is on our faculty, and so really is well suited to talk today. Just a little bit of housekeeping, and then we'll get right into it. We'll answer questions at the conclusion of the presentation, but type them in at any point into the text chat. Post a question in the text chat. We'll be monitoring it, and we'll answer just as many as we possibly can. Microphones and webcams are not being activated for participants in the session today, so if you want to communicate with us, please do it through the text chat. We'll be sending a link to the recording, and we'll send you a set of the slides to all registrants, and they'll be available on our webinar webpage as well as our YouTube channel. And if you want, at the end of the presentation, I'll discuss how to receive a participation certificate. It's available upon request for both live session viewers and those who watch us the recording on demand. All right, as I mentioned, our presentation today is Cybersecurity Challenges in the Financial Sector, presented by Dr. Susan Goodwin. And it's just a delight to have Dr. Goodwin here today, and she is certainly well qualified both academically and career-wise to be with us. Now, I'm going to make sure that I do this right, so I'm going to read a little bit to you. She is a cybersecurity consultant for a major American IT consulting firm. She's also an adjunct professor of cybersecurity and a dissertation chair for capital. By dissertation chair, that means she is supervising other individuals who are working on their doctorate in cybersecurity. She's also was formerly the Assistant Vice President for Compliance and Operational Risk, and also the Assistant Vice President for Testing and Information Security for Bank of America. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Computer Science and 2 master's degrees, one in IT and one in Cybersecurity, from the University of Massachusetts Lowell, and she earned her PhD in Technology from Capital Technology University. She's very active in a number of organizations, including IEEE and the Society of Women Engineers. And as you can see here, she has vast industry engineering experience. I won't read those to you, but as you can tell, she's covered the waterfront. She has a lot of experience in many different areas, primarily focusing, of course, in the cyber world. And as an aside, in her spare time, which I don't think there's a whole lot of, but in her spare time, she enjoys playing the cello and the flute. And I thought about that later. I don't think she plays those both at the same time. That would be a trick. Now, with that, I want to stop right there. Oh, and I'm going to stop sharing, and the slides will go over to Dr. Goodwin, who will be sharing her slides. So give us a moment to make that happen. All right. Okay, Dr. Goodwin, you should be able to share your screen at this point. Excellent. All right,
Hi.
There we go.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very
floor.
much. Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
We can.
Terrific. Well, thank you all very much for joining us. I'm very glad to have you here, and I hope this session will be informative to you. It's for a wide level of audience here. So if you do have questions, as Mr. Gibbs said, could you please enter them in the text box, and we will do the best we can to answer them for you. I really enjoy working with students at the university, and I'm very happy this is my first presentation here. So I have allergies, so if my voice cracks a little bit, it's springtime allergies here in Florida. Okay, so let's go to the next slide here. Okay, my agenda. First, I'll talk a little bit about my research that I did for my dissertation at the university, which I completed in December of 2020. I will go into some of financial sector cybersecurity challenges, and I will discuss some cybersecurity frameworks as my recommendations to some solutions for some of these challenges. And I will discuss one of these frameworks, which was the focus of my dissertation, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. I'll speak to some of my recommendations that I provided in my dissertation and my conclusion, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. So my research focused on the analysis of reported financial sector risks, failures, and impacts, and mainly due to weak or lack of cybersecurity controls. And I also analyzed success stories of sector entities which adopted the cybersecurity framework. I found from my dissertation, especially during the beginnings of and during the first year of 2020 of the COVID-19 pandemic, that there was an upward trend of cybersecurity attacks in the US financial sector. And I determined that there was a need of an adoption of some cybersecurity best practices throughout the sector in order to mitigate this upward trend. So I found that this trend between 2018 and 2020 continued to increase, and there was no decrease in the trends. I provided a link to my dissertation for further research if you would like to read more about that. The challenges that I found during the 2020 the first year of the pandemic, the cybersecurity attack opportunists took full advantage of this. And they, especially in the financial sector. In 2020, authors Kellerman and Murphy published a report called Modern Bank Heists, and this was a large focus of my research. It is a wonderful, comprehensive report across the financial sector in which the authors interviewed 25 chief information security officers from leading financial institutions to gather this information. There's a link below where you can read further on their report. And diving into many of the findings of the report, 27% of cyber attacks in 2020 either targeted healthcare or financial sector, according to this report. And over 1/4 of these reports occurred during the first 5 months of 2020, and they targeted the financial and healthcare sectors. And there are 16 critical infrastructure sectors within the United States critical infrastructure, with healthcare and financial being part of that. I also found during my research that 82% of surveyed financial institutions said cyber criminals are more sophisticated now. They're leveraging highly targeted social engineering and advanced tactics. And these criminals exploit weaknesses in people, processes, and technology. And that enabled the ability to transfer funds and to exfiltrate sensitive data. 82%, that's amazing. That's just a very, very large number that everyone should be concerned with, especially those who make decisions in the financial sector. 64% of these financial institutions reported increased attempts of wire transfer fraud. So there was a very large increase over the 17% in the previous year. And this only happened the first 5 months of 2020. And this was also during the beginning of the pandemic. So there was definitely a tie-in with this. 25% of surveyed financial institutions were targeted by destructive attacks. But destructive attacks are rarely conducted for financial gain. Usually the attacks are launched to be punitive by destroying data rather than financial gain. One risk is permanent loss of data, especially when a financial sector entity, a bank, does not have a data backup plan. And a data backup plan, it should be among the best practices, but the risks have been compromised. Ransomware attacks against the financial sector actually increased by 9 times from the beginning of February to the end of April. So in a matter of months, increased 9-fold. This statistical upward trend occurred during the onset of the pandemic. So again, there is a tie-in. % of surveyed financial institutions experienced a watering hole attack during the past year. And what that means is financial institutions and bank regulation websites are hijacked and used to pollute visitors' browsers. So visitors' browsers are compromised because of the hijacking. And cyber criminals recognize the implicit trust consumers have in bank brands. So a consumer can go to the bank that they always use their website without realizing that the websites have been hijacked. And the research results demonstrate that the number of cyber attacks in the US continue to grow in an upward trend between the beginning of 2018 and the end of the first 5 months of 2020. And the trend continued to increase upon the emergence of the pandemic, such as the number of ransomware attacks multiplying by 9 times during those first few months of 2020. Cyber criminals became more sophisticated in exploiting weaknesses in people during this time, and the actors took advantage of the pandemic. And again, there's a lot more detail in the link that I provide below. So you may have seen in the news, you may have seen in reports that the increase there's always been an increase, but it has not been so severe as it has been during 2020. And what I saw, when I found with my research for my dissertation, was that across the financial sector, banking entities, financial entities do not necessarily follow the best practices, or they have not adopted fully, if at all, a cybersecurity framework. And a framework can provide guidance, consistent guidance for mitigating, preventing cybersecurity incidents, both internal and external. Some more information that I found during my research was that there were some studies performed on recommendations for different cybersecurity frameworks. that the financial sector should implement or could implement, or if they already are, to perform some improvements on their implementation. Parmeet Roy, who was a cybersecurity consultant, performed a study, and he compared two frameworks, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, which I will discuss a little more in detail, and the ISO 27001 Information Security Standard. I can provide some links after the talk to give you more information on both of these standards, but these standards have been established for several years throughout industry, and not just for the financial sector, but across various sectors have adopted each of these standards. They've been proven to work, and Mr. Roy found that both frameworks do provide robust methodologies, ensuring the three pillars of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. However, he tended to favor the NIST cybersecurity framework over ISO because the structure of the NIST framework enables its implementation at an enterprise level, and the framework is more user-friendly and is more streamlined. So adoptability and adaptability seem to be a lot easier for the former, the NIST cybersecurity framework. That's what I found during my research. I'll go into some detail about this framework as well. And the NIST framework, which is actually NIST meaning the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who's been around for many, many years, providing standards for recommendations and guidance across various different sectors. They published the first version in 2014, and then there was an updated version in 2017. And this framework was developed as a joint effort between the US federal government and the private sector with many subject matter experts. It serves only as a guideline, and it's not mandated by any legal authority. So no one is required to adopt this, especially in the financial sector. They're not required to adopt this framework. It's completely voluntary. It serves as a guidance. And the guidance, which is provided by the NIST framework, proactively addresses many different elements. The most important one to me is risk management, and planning cybersecurity incident response, setting policies, processes, and procedures, planning the requirements, planning controls, planning post-incident analysis, and planning mitigation for future incidents. So you can see that this framework provides for planning guidance most of all. And but most important to me anyway is the risk management. How do you handle risk, and how do you prepare for risk, and how do you be proactive? Here below, and also at the bottom of the slide in the next few slides, is the link to this cyber framework, which explains exactly what it is. I will give some examples from what it's actually only like a 58-page document, this framework. So it's not very detailed, very comprehensive. It's not hundreds and hundreds of pages, but 58 pages, there's a lot of diagrams, and there's a lot of brief explanations to providing this guidance. It's not very difficult for someone who would be supporting an IT department or across an enterprise or a smaller company to implement this framework. It's very high level, and it is also, you can change it, you can scale it. It doesn't necessarily have to apply to only a large entity. It can apply to a small bank or a small company. In this case, I'll go into detail, providing some actual cases where its implementation is successful. The framework itself consists of three components: framework core, implementation tiers, and profile. And again, and this is a link below here, which gives more detail with my source where I was able to find this information. The framework core, which is very, very high level, it's a set of cybersecurity activities. And keep in mind too that this cybersecurity framework does not necessarily just apply to the financial sector. It can apply to any sector, but these principles here for cybersecurity apply to any situation, any company, any entity. As in order to prevent, mitigate, you need to have functions, categories, and subcategories. You need to, the high-level functions for every single instance of cybersecurity, you need to identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. So this can apply to anywhere where you must implement cybersecurity. And the framework core is designed to be intuitive and simplistic. I'll show you in the next slide. This actually is what each category is represented by each function in the framework core. So taking a look at this diagram, you can actually see all of these different categories can apply to any entity in any situation, any company, any large or small. Asset management, business environment, governance. For identify, protecting, you must have data, you must protect your data. For detection, detect. Continuous monitoring is very crucial. Response, analysis of your response, mitigation of response, and recovery planning and communications. Most of all, you see communications in several of these different categories. So these are the 5 main framework core pieces of the framework. And this is just something that, that any IT department, any cybersecurity team should implement. Again, this is just guidance, but these are general principles. In the framework itself too, there are implementation tiers. In each of these tiers describes the degree to which an organization risk management can show characteristics. And I'll show you with the diagram, it'll explain a little easier by looking at the diagram. There's 4 different tiers, and it depends on how well the cybersecurity risk decision. So it depends on your company, depends on the size of the organization, it depends on the requirements to which tier that the organization would be aligned with. So this has to do with risk management. You can see tier 1 is partial, where you're only implementing the framework partially. Tier 2 is risk informed. Tier 3 is repeatable, where you have processes that are instituted and repeatable. And tier 4 is adaptive, which means if there is change in a configuration or an environment within your cybersecurity situation, tier 4 is the highest level. And the third part of the framework is the profile. And this is where an organization actually aligns uniquely with its requirements, objectives, risk appetite, and resources. So this is where the scaling is involved here. As part of the guidance of this cybersecurity framework from NIST, each organization can determine its profile and can be used to identify opportunities. You can have your current profile, you can take a snapshot of what your organization currently has in place for cybersecurity, and you can identify a target profile where you would like to be based on improvements in your cybersecurity environment. So this is the present, is the current profile, and where you want to be, where your improvements are, would be your target profile. And in the case of the financial sector, for instance, a bank or a large bank which has several small branches and so forth could look at this at the higher level. What is the corporate level, the enterprise level, rather than in the individual banks, how each individual bank has it, because this is the software that the bank uses for their depositors, for their customers, would be used across the board. So it would be at that higher level where this profile could be identified. Take a snapshot. What do you have now set in your cybersecurity? What controls do you have in place? What is your plan in case something happens to the system, the cyber system? What do you have in place if there's an environmental issue? And then where do you want to be? Do you have these, what improvements do you want to make? And that would be your target profile. In this instance here, what I'm showing in this diagram is how the profile would be set up. You would have your business objectives, that would be across enterprise, and the threat environment, that would be, like, you probably can't see it too well because it's rather small. This shows like Target, Home Depot, Anthem, various different companies in various different sectors. In the case of banking, this would be the threat environment within the banking, within the financial sector, compromising credit cards, compromising accounts, internal threats, external threats, and then requirements and controls that are currently in place that are required from regulatory information. And then all of these would be taken into consideration to say, here is your profile. You would snapshot what do you currently have in place here with your business objectives, your threat environment, and your requirements and controls, and place those into your cybersecurity profile. And that was just a quick overview of what the profile is, what the cybersecurity framework offers. It offers guidance. It offers a flexible plan for cybersecurity planning for any industry, but specifically what I found it to be, the implementation of it would be extremely beneficial for the financial sector. The authors of this framework intended its guidance to be voluntarily adaptable, not only by US organizations, but actually across the world. And there actually have been implementations in various different countries which have been successful. My focus on my research has been strictly with United States financial entities. And the findings and recommendations are examples such as US financial sector entities can apply to any organization. Well, I said that previously, but specifically for the financial sector, what I'm looking for here. And these principles here, this is very general, but applying these to, you think about, again, about the financial sector with vulnerabilities, with people having their accounts compromised, having destruction of data, the alignment of mission objectives with the cybersecurity decisions, organizational requirements, communication to stakeholders, including suppliers and partners, civil liberties, current state and expressed desired state. Again, that would align with the profile, current state and expressed desired state. Prioritize cybersecurity resources and announce risk analysis and expenditure trade-offs. So that, again, this is just a list of what the cybersecurity framework offers. Aligning that with the banking industry, you can see here how critical it is to have all of these in place, especially as far as finances are concerned. And I have asserted in my dissertation that I do think the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, I highly recommend that it should be implemented uniformly across the financial sector based on the success stories, especially in 3 academic institutions. I could see that there were gaps identified, funding opportunities, better understanding by team members of their roles. And this was at the University of Kansas. And the University of Pittsburgh did not actually have a centralized cybersecurity management standard. And what the University of Pittsburgh did was they did implement the framework, and they found that they found vast improvements. They had consistency in data management standards. They executed their security assessment across the organization, and they found that they needed prioritization. This, again, can be applied to financial sector as well. And these are examples of success stories, which I think show a very strong point. And then the Biological Sciences Division of University of Chicago Similarly, they aligned their risk expectations. They were able to determine a common set of target outcomes, and they prioritized their security goals. So I concluded by seeing 3 examples in academia of success stories, case studies of implementation of this framework. If it's been very successful in academia, why not apply it to financial, which is very critical. What I wanted to also point out too is continuous monitoring. That should be in any cybersecurity implementation. Continuous monitoring, not just set it and go and walk away from it. There must be continuous monitoring, especially as we found below, as I mentioned earlier, the exploitations in the financial sector, the vast increase in incidents in the financial sector shows that continuous monitoring had some weaknesses and definitely needed some improvements. So based on all this information that I found about the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, I determined several recommendations specifically aimed at the financial sector for implementation. Being one of the 16 Department of Homeland Security critical infrastructure sectors, I think it should be adopted based on the risk impacts and inconsistency and accountability of best practices across the sector. In other words, as I mentioned before, there is not a consistent implementation of any framework across the financial sector. Large banks, small banks, and they all must report to regulatory authorities. And based on government reports and industry reports that I found in my research, there's a lot lacking here. So in seeing the increase in all of the cyber compromise activity, especially the past few years, definitely proves the case. This framework provides a tailorable, that's the key word right there, it's tailorable. There may be resistance to adopting a framework such as the NIST cybersecurity framework because it's too big for an organization, it's too wieldy, it's too, it could be, maybe it needs to be, it's just too much to implement. We're doing fine the way we are. Tailorable is keyword. I actually worked at a company which was a technical startup some years ago. And they had started getting some government contracts. And in order to succeed at obtaining these government contracts, they needed to formalize their processes and procedures. So part of my work was to work with a team to institute some internal procedures, formalize these procedures, and make them repeatable. And that seems to be, to me, in my research, what the case should be for the banking industry, for the financial sector industry, because we're seeing repeats of financial compromise. So in order to mitigate all of that, there must be some sort of tailorable best practices instituted, especially risk management. And I found that this framework, again, has been proven to be successful, determined in case studies from academia and various industries. And it actually has been proven to reduce cyber risk impacts, and it strengthens the organization's cybersecurity infrastructure. So I believe that I have built a very strong case for the banking industry to adopt a framework such as the NIST cybersecurity framework. It may not necessarily have to be that particular framework. These are just my findings based on that one example. But I propose and I recommend that the US banking industry should adopt, and not only, and one of the best other benefits of adopting a framework like this would be consistency in reporting. The auditors, it would make the auditors work easier. They can go and look at across the board the way that this is implemented. Be easier for them to see if there's consistency in process. So my conclusion, based on these findings, is that the U.S. financial section should take action to adopt consistent cybersecurity practices, especially shown by the vulnerabilities that were exposed during the pandemic. And otherwise, the risk impacts will continue to rise as the cyber criminals will become more sophisticated. And vulnerabilities during this pandemic include gaps in infrastructure personnel coverage, security infrastructure weaknesses due to employees working from home, and delays of infrastructure updates. There were just some things that happened, some gaps that happened during the pandemic that couldn't be helped, but because of this environment, these gaps were recognized as being causes of these vulnerabilities. So by having a framework in place that can help with planning, future planning, can help with faster mitigation of issues and so forth. And so by having a framework in place, such as the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, this can provide guidance for prevention and mitigation of such vulnerabilities. Now, as far as the consumer goes, the consumer also needs to be aware. And I think that what's very important is that there should be more training for, especially as banking becomes more and more online. I have heard of banks closing their branches and encouraging the consumers to rely more on online banking or on the phone. And some users may not have the technology expertise or knowledge or access to what's going on here too. So there also needs to be, I think, from the banking industry, better knowledge distributed to the consumers, how to make your own accounts safer, and by having this in place too, because that includes stakeholders, and you, the consumer, are a stakeholder. So that's what I have. That was a lot of my research. That's a lot of information. I provided the links, and if anyone has any questions, please feel free to type them in, and we will take it from there.
And there are a lot of questions and some excellent questions. Dr. Goodwin, first of all, thank you for this marvelous presentation. And we'll go ahead and leave that slide up, share your screen again so that they have your email address. But in the meanwhile, let's go ahead and start through these questions. And the first question comes from George. It says, I'm curious why so many banks do not offer physical 2FA keys rather than SMS.
What was the FA? What was
he says, I'm curious as to why so many banks do not offer physical 2FA keys rather than SMS.
That I really can't answer to, since I worked specifically for one bank. I think that is another example of banks across the sector having inconsistency in their implementations of a lot of different things. It's good to have options. It's good to go and trust into different banks which have implemented these. I really, and again, I can't speak to that. It depends on, it's the decision of each individual bank or entity. And that's where I come in and say, I recommend there needs to be more consistency in implementation of not just cybersecurity, but in instances like this.
Dr. Lawless and also Dr. Martin have clarified what they meant. I wasn't familiar with these terms. 2FA is two-factor authentication. Mm-hmm. And then Dr. Lawless expands by saying that would customer physical two-factor authentication USB keys avoid potential cyber attacks or denial of service cyber attacks as opposed to SMS telephony attack vectors?
Well, with the two-factor authentication, that's an instance of that would be where you would be asked a secondary question. You would send to your, you would say, for instance, log into your account online, and then you would be prompted to send a code to your cell phone, and you would go back and enter that cell phone, the code that you receive on your cell phone, back into your login. For the SMS, the telephony, yeah, that's at a different level. I'm not sure, again, why banks tend to favor one over the other. That to me is a corporate decision.
I'm sure that they're balancing customer convenience with the risk of cyber attack and trying to balance that out so that, because they could make them so hardened that nobody could penetrate, including the customers. So I'm sure that that is a balance. And by the way, I gave George a promotion. I guess he's not a PhD as I thought he was. He's just smart enough. He's got his master's degree in information assurance. Now, let me come back and get back onto some of these other questions. And this was not a question, but I wanted to just point it out. Aslek talked about Dr. Mary Aiken's book on cyber psychology. I want to recommend, she's also on our faculty along with Dr. Goodwin. I recommend that book to anyone who's interested in how social engineering impacts cyber crime and among other areas. Now, Aslak asked this question, he said, and I think you've answered this, is the NIST framework designed only to work within the financial sector? And I think the answer that you gave later after his question was asked was no, it works for everybody, correct?
Yes, it is actually, it's generic. It is used across all sorts of different sectors globally, actually, too. If you browse to the link where the actual NIST page is, you can see instances of where it is applied. It's academia, in the banking industry, and healthcare, across the board. Any industry can, and a large company, a small company can use this too. It's very flexible, and it's only a 58-page document that provides general principles and guidance that companies who are involved with cybersecurity must follow anyway. That's how I look at it. Yeah, it's a consistent guidance.
Frankie asked this question. He said, Dr. Goodwin, I'm a current student working on my dissertation at Capital. By the way, thank you, Frankie, for that. My topic is covering small community banks and how they identify and remediate security vulnerabilities. I'm looking at a specific small community bank with a case study, but I'm curious to see if any of your data was based on financial institution size or just over the entire financial sector.
My research was basically over the entire financial sector, and I did focus on a couple of different instances of large entities. JP Morgan had some cybersecurity compromises. Bank of America, at the time of my report, actually had implemented the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, and at the time that I began my research, they had not yet had any attacks. In contrast to JP Morgan. So yeah, I was looking at more the larger scale of entities.
Several questions, including one from Pete, had to do with, they were curious as to why you believe that there was an increase in attacks during the pandemic.
Well, this was a lot. I only gave an example. It's, in the best interest of time for my presentation here today, I only gave one example, but I actually found a lot of different examples, and I've got a lot of, I lost track of how many references that I was able to find, but there was many different references that I was able to, reports, peer-reviewed reports, and government reports, and so forth, that did have these findings. And there were actually some subject matter experts in cybersecurity who spoke with Congress recommending that the financial sector should implement a framework or implement more best practices based on findings that happened during the pandemic.
As part of the regulatory environment, that would be a requirement, as distinct from voluntary as it is now.
Yes, yes, that was the key point of my dissertation, saying, well, right now it's voluntary, but because of vulnerabilities, because the increase in vulnerabilities and not really seeing any end to it, there should be something mandatory in there from the regulatory perspective. That was my recommendation.
All right.
Because at the very end, it impacts the consumers, the stakeholders, most important to me.
And there were two questions revolving around nation-state attacks. Isaac asked if there was a correlation between financially motivated and nation-state attacks, and George asks whether the recent cyber attacks in against Ukraine, against banks and hospitals, were, in your estimation, simply opportunistic hackers, or was it a nation-state based?
Right now, we don't have all the information, and I'm not privy to the information. Based on just what I know right now, it's hard to say. It could be a combination of both. It could be just it could be nation state, it could be other smaller entities taking advantage of the times and jumping in on it too. So there's multiple different factors, but until there's more investigation on all of this, since it's in the early stages, I really can't say at this time.
Right, it would be very difficult to ascertain that at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Tamara asks, did your research review the interagency guidelines of the federal financial institution regulators in the U.S. Department of Treasury and the Federal Reserve?
FFIC, Federal Reserve, yes, I had a lot of different, I had like about 100 or so references in my dissertation, so I did a lot. This was over several years of research. I actually began my research in 2015, and I had some time off in between. I took a sabbatical during my research, and then when I came back to it, it was in 2019, and then 2020, as the pandemic happened, then I started to see news reports, government reports, formal reports, and peer-reviewed reports of more and more instances of the increase in cybersecurity incidents, especially in the financial sector. So sort of like following the timeline. And then I saw in the middle of my research, all of this started happening. So I kind of steered my dissertation into this direction. I was going to go in a slightly different direction, but I was able to focus more on this and say, oh, this is very crucial what's happening right now. I see a lot of a reason to build a stronger case for why, because we didn't anticipate all of this. But what can banks do? There was an instance of a bank, which shall be unnamed at this moment, that I heard some time back that there was the weather last year in Texas, which knocked out, it was the unexpected bad storms that happened in Texas. And how often are there such storms in Texas? Not very often. We're talking snow, we're talking really bad weather. And so some banks were hit by this, and they went down, the systems went down, the consumer didn't have access, and it was not just an hour or two, this was days. And so what should have been done, it's not just cybersecurity from bad actors, but environmental can happen too. Even if it's an unexpected case, it's a rare case, there, in my view, in my research, there should always be consistently any kind of disaster planning, no matter what. It could be an earthquake, it could be anything. Do you have redundancy in your systems elsewhere? Do you have your backups? Do you have everything in place for this too? There should be worst case scenario, even though it might be unanticipated, it should be. And as a result of what happened in Texas, there was a cost to that.
This in a personal aside.
There was a lot of cost involved with that.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. I just want to mention, I'm actually based in the Austin, Texas area, and so I lived through that storm as you were just discussing. And one of the things that has come out of that is there was not just a cold, there was a lack of power, and in many cases, because of lack of power, water lines froze, burst, and flooded everything. And so there were institutions that had backups, but all of the backups were on site. And the water came from the sprinkler system or wherever, from the overhead pipes, and a lot of damage that was done. And one of the lessons that I've been hearing is that if you're going to back up, which you should do, of course, that backup be either in the cloud or not just completely out of the building, but probably in another state in this particular case.
Absolutely.
And of course, cloud storage has its own issues as well. I want to stay on track. We're just about up on time. I wanted to mention that Dr. Ron Martin has listed 2 links. I would encourage you to click on those links now and then save them in your browser. And the reason is that there's no way to actually save the chat. And so, I mean, for you to save the chat, these are excellent links. And so I would go ahead and do that. Now, let me, Dr. Goodwin has stopped sharing our screen. So let me start sharing mine, because we move now to the conclusion. And if we do have time, we will come back and catch just a little bit more questions. So hang on, Dr. Goodwin. But let me make sure that I cover this material first. We have upcoming webinars actually through June, but I only show the next 3. If you're interested in cybersecurity and infrastructure, you'll be sure to want to join our next session with Dr. Nikki Robinson on infrastructure critical challenges and the differences between how publics and privates are responding to those challenges, particularly in the area of cyber. This is all related primarily to cyber. And as we already know, private organizations handle things differently than public ones, and she'll be talking about that. Then I have 2 very interesting webinars, one in April and one in May, that I think you'll be interested in, particularly if you are fairly early in your career or even a student right now. The first one with with Connie Harrington, who is our career search and job finding lady here at the university. Text career skills, identification and communication in writing a resume. Many people with technical backgrounds do not know how to incorporate that technical education, technical expertise into an effective resume, and consequently may be overlooked for a job promotion or a new job simply because they did not communicate very effectively their expertise levels. She'll be talking about that on how to prepare your resume to really hit the target. Then related to that, in May, the second part of the series is tips for finding career success in technology. Bernard Wright is a noted jobs coach, and he'll be talking about what to do to get your career really on track and taking it to where you want to go in the field of technology. So the first one in April, we'll really talk about that first starting, getting that resume or moving on to the next job. This one will talk about staying in the job, getting promoted, learning your skill and craft, and succeeding in your technical career. That's all coming up. Now, this is, it's easy to get to that. Just go to this web page and you can log in and register for any of the webinars. They're all free. Now, for those of you that are viewing this live, this is fine. For those of you that are going to view this later, this is also good. We're going to send a copy of the slides and a link to everyone who's registered. And so watch for that email. When you get the email, you will have the opportunity to request a certificate of completion. Wait to do that until you get that email, which will come out later today or first thing in the morning, and we will make that certificate available to you if you would like one. You're not required to, but if you would like it for your own purposes, we'll be happy to send you one. Now, this is the final slide, but we actually have a few more minutes, and so I want to see if there's any additional questions. That last call for questions while we still have Dr. Goodwin on the line. Several questions have talked about why things went up during the pandemic. I don't think there's a question for Dr. Goodwin in that necessarily as much as to say that's probably a research topic waiting to be looked into. So those of you who are students and are looking for good research topics, it'd be fantastic to know what was happening there. were people just simply home more and more ability to get into mischief, or is it a much more significant thing? Aslak asks a good question, Dr. Goodwin, that I would like to throw out to you. Is all of this a challenge for the CEO, or is it a problem that is not really having to do with an individual company, but it's a societal issue that needs to be addressed? It's kind of a broad question, isn't it?
It's very broad. I think the cybersecurity can impact almost everyone who's involved in, whatever kind of business or school or anything in our lives. Yeah, I think across the board, there should be more stringent guidance applied across the board.
Roxana Allen asks an excellent question. She says cybersecurity is very expensive, which is what we know. The expertise in that level is very expensive to purchase. Do you recommend embedding it into the organization's annual budget as the best practice?
That's actually part of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, for example, is to include cybersecurity planning, by considering budget needs. Definitely, I recommend that.
And I see that you, if I'd scrolled down, I would have seen you the answer.
I was multitasking, and I apologize for misspelling her name. Trying to get it right. Yes. An organization, they should plan it in not just a one-time thing. It should be as needed, and to systems and personnel and practices and studies, and bringing in consultants. Those kinds of things should all be taken into consideration in companies or an organization's planning for cybersecurity. Definitely should be part of the budget. That's what I found in my research.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to, in a moment, end the webinar officially, but I would be amiss if I did not mention that the university is going to roll out CMMC training. CMMC, as many of you know, stands for Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. And it is becoming rapidly important, especially in the defense industry. Anybody who is a subcontractor or contractor with doing things for the Department of Defense pretty much will need to have their entire cybersecurity system mature and hardened. And this training will give the certification that the companies need. I will not list anything here, but if you are interested in that, thank you, Diane. I was going to say we'll make sure that we include that copy when we send out your email, but thank you. There it is, and that would be excellent. The first training will start on March 7th. I'd like to stop at that point. It's right almost exactly at the top of the hour. I'd like to thank our presenter, Dr. Goodwin, for taking this on and sharing her research with us. And I'd like to thank her personally too for stepping in. As many of you know, the speaker we had arranged for was not able to make this session, and very much at the last minute, Dr. Goodwin, out of the goodness of her heart, has shared her expertise with us, and I really appreciate that. So thank you, everyone, and look forward to an email from me with a link to the recording, information on this, on how to get a participation certificate, and a link to the slides as well. With that, we are officially done, and you may log off at any time.
Thank you, everyone.